Something is a curator at Namaka, one of our pillars of strength to take over and make the introductions, following this.
A great delight to, privilege to be asked to introduce V. Geeta to you, not just because we share the same name. She is a woman of many parts, wears many hats. Some of you may not know all the hats that she wears, but over the years, we have not met very often, over the years, I've discovered all the hats that she wears. She is, Wikipedia lists her as a feminist historian. Yeah, but she's a doyen among feminists. She's a feminist activist, and has her own stand among feminists and very highly respected there. She's an anti-caste scholar. She is also an author of several seminal works, essays, the 3 big publications, including the Non-Brahmin Millennium, which came out in the 90s. This she co-authored with Rajadurai. This was on the Periyar movement in Tamil Nadu. I think one of her first major books. She is also, she is very beloved of anti-caste students all over India. This I discover whenever you go to some corner and you meet some young Dalit students who are studying in universities, and they take up her name because she has mentored many of them. I don't know even Geeta knows, but she's beloved of all these students whom she has helped every now and then. She is also very, she's very obliging to people who want things done. Because those of us who work in this sphere, anti-caste, progressive, left spectrum, we don't have too many people who oblige us because we are not very safe people. But Geeta, always you ask her for an introduction, a foreword, read this, review this, suggest that, and she comes back very fast and very promptly with her suggestions. And last but not the least, she has all the right enemies. That is, her only enemies, she's got lots of friends, but her only enemies are the Hindutva right. So she's got the right enemies too. So that is, in some part, an introduction to V. Geeta. Though I'm sure there's so much more about her that one should be saying. I forgot, she is a translator from Tamil to English and English to Tamil too. So she introduced Perumal Murugan to us. She introduced Revati, autobiography of a Hijra life story. Revati, Perumal Murugan, Imayam also, if I'm not mistaken, not Imayam, and several other things. And she's also working on across South Asia. She's working with Sri Lankan accounts of what happened during the war, several other things. Geeta, she's got her fingers in every pie possible in the anti-caste left spectrum. So that's V. Geeta for you.
Thanks so much. Hi, that was very flattering. Thanks for having me here, and thanks Biju Matthews, wherever you are. Yes, so for bullying me into coming here. So I'm going to go straight into what I have to do, which is deliver this memorial lecture. I've titled it Time is Out of Joint, and there are enough English literature students here to know where that's from. And others as well who are familiar with Shakespeare and Hamlet. And it's always been one of my favorite lines because I think it captures a range of meanings about how many of us feel in times of uncertainty, in times of hatred, in times where things that we trust and believe in as decent human beings don't appear to make sense. But in a wider sense also, I wish to invoke Hamlet because those who are familiar with the play know that Hamlet is a prince of Denmark. He comes back to the kingdom to find his father has been murdered by his uncle, and his mother, as he says, before the funeral, for him, the collapse of the polity and comparing that collapse to time itself making no sense and Denmark being a prison are terms that characterize so much of what we endure in India today in different ways. Though we might not trust in a natural order that we think is right, we do know that a lot of things are not right in India in different ways. And our time is out of joint as well. And I just want to explain that using 4 different examples, because I think it's also something that many of us perhaps talk in our own circles. Let me start with the circle I know best, the feminist circle. We've all been very anguished by the different developments around the gender question in the country today. One is, of course, what we read in the papers almost every other day, incidents of violence that appears to be growing, though that's never clear whether it has ever stopped or whether it has become more or less. But clearly there's a certain new sort of impunity that it's all right to be doing these things. It's all right to be ignoring these things, and it's okay to be indifferent. And we see that in the most problematic ways. For example, in the judgments around the Domestic Violence Act, a lot of these judgments of recent vintage across high courts, you see how the family is again being reaffirmed without any sort of inquiry into why do these cases come to the courts in the first place. And everything is being reduced to the instrumental use of the law by women. This was always there when the Domestic Violence Act was introduced. And as feminists, we've reflected on it and we've tried to go back and rethink what is it about this act that we want to do differently now. In your own city, there was a conference on the Domestic Violence Act several years ago at Anveshi, I think. So it's not that people haven't thought about it, but I think there's a new sort of, I hesitate to say orthodoxy. Orthodoxy is a position. This is more a sort of misogyny, which is quite frightening. A very dismissive attitude towards women claiming rights. Even before those rights can be discussed, it's almost as if they have no business claiming these rights. And of course, acts of sexual violence that you see on the increase, and very disturbing stories that one hears in different places. So makes you wonder, what is it that has been accomplished by the women's movements over the last so many years? Are we sort of seeing the clock being turned back? And that word is what I want to focus on, because we feel as feminists that we have no great investment in tradition. We've been critical about tradition. We may reclaim parts of it, but we've had a problem with tradition as such. And we've been firmly rooted in the present, in the times of the modern. So for us to actually have the past come back in different ways makes us wonder, what is it that modernity has done for women? And this again, we've discussed many, many times, as it opened up spaces, as it meant that we just have an updated version of older and more inegalitarian values, being part of our reality. So this sense of time is, I think, more than ever, particularly sort of confusing for us, also because we're living under the political dispensation, which is steeped in impunity, which is not interested in any sort of rethinking of anything. And it's a fairly shameless government. And, Marx once said, shame is a revolutionary emotion. We know this. And so suddenly this government is not revolutionary, but it's also very shameless. And shamelessness and impunity go together because there's no remorse, there's no rethinking of anything. And you see that especially when it comes to crimes against minority women, Muslim women in particular, but also in certain sections of the country against Christian women, Odisha, parts of Jharkhand. But more generally, Muslim women, it's almost as if that there's no way that you need to even discuss this because they deserve what they get. This is a sort of impunity that's being conveyed to us in different ways. So as feminists, we wonder what is this and what has gone wrong, especially since some of us have been working on these issues for several decades now, and we are not quite sure why have we come to this pass, and time appears to have been suddenly collapsed in some ways. Likewise with the Dalit question, I think. As much as feminists and perhaps even more Dalits have been invested in the modern moment. Ambedkar famously said at the Mahat Satyagraha that injustice has no tradition, meaning to say you can't justify untouchability through pointing to, customary rights, or that, this is a practice that you can't question because it's custom and you have to respect these rights and so on. That's when he famously said injustice has no tradition. And I think what you see also is that for all the struggles, the claims made in the name of fundamental rights or the constitution, and all the effort put in by communities to access education, work, suddenly you also see a kind of a backlash. And that backlash, I'm sorry to say, I find extremely disturbing in my own home state, which is known for its history of social justice, especially caste-based injustice. And most recently, some of you might have read in the papers about the very horrific death of this young Dalit man, a man who had studied engineering, was working in a software company, and who was in love with a girl who was not from his community. And he was brutally murdered by the girl's brother. And I say brutally because it was just not an act of killing, or what the media calls honor killing. It was actually an act of extreme violence. The young man's eye was gouged out because it's been imposed on them. And caste Hindus should ask themselves how they are compromising their own humanity and the humanity of other people. And basically, he said it's beyond just any opportunist anger at Dalits. It's beyond any sort of, they have done this and therefore I'm doing this to them. And he uses words from social psychology to characterize that hatred and resentment, the social psychology of his time. So he says Dalits seem to invoke in caste Hindus nausea. He uses the word nausea. He uses the term social odium. He uses the term aversion. So he's talking about an almost embodied response, disgust. And for Dalits, this is a huge shock. At one level, it's evident that it's not gone away. But at another level, their everyday struggles, everyday lives, their faith in the constitution. And as people in civil liberties movements know, they've been amongst the most faithful supporters of civil liberties movements. They turn up for every public hearing. They file 100,000 affidavits again and again, should you want them to. So to be actually constantly reminded of who you ought to be is also something which collapses time for them. And what is this time of the modern? Because one of the things that again and again you heard Dalit groups say in the media after the death of this murder of this young man was, but how could this be? This is not a hapless agricultural laborer in a village. This is a man who's educated, who's working in a software company, who's earning 2.5 lakhs a month. His murderer is educated. He was an all India athlete of some repute. Why would he do this? So, and I think this why would he do this now is something that's very bothersome. And there again, time is out of joint. Now, these two are at the level, gender and caste inequalities, I think are of a certain kind because as feminists, as anti-caste thinkers and activists, we've always felt that the time of the now is important for us, not simply tradition or the past and so on, but now this is where we claim our rights, this is where we are. But then there are other kinds of things that have gone wrong, which belong to the time of what we would all like to believe, the time of the Indian Republic, the promises that 1947 held for some people or for many people. And I think that time is also sort of, completely out of joint. And to me, nothing symbolizes it more than the literal and figurative act of bulldozing that we see widespread in Adityanath's Uttar Pradesh and in Madhya Pradesh. I mean, sure, municipal corporations use the bulldozer to remove what they call encroachments. We see this in most cities. That itself is an action that ought not to be countenanced. But then you have this deliberate act of erasing people's homes and lives. And this is in complete defiance of constitutional guarantees, so much so the Supreme Court had to wrap the government on 2 occasions, at least if I'm not mistaken. But yet, the act seems to continue in one way or the other. And to me, it's such a betrayal of the promises of the Republic. Because I think for every Muslim who migrated to Pakistan, there were countless that stayed back, identifying with this nation, wanting to be part of this space. And that betrayal is something that is also a betrayal of Republican time, the time of the Indian Republic, and the time of equality that it promised. Because one of the claims of the Indian nationalist movement was that it was not a communal movement. Now, I leave that to you to decide whether it was or it was not. But that certainly was a public claim, and I think partially it was also affirmed in some positive ways. But the point is this, that time is now seen as a time of loss. That's not there with us anymore. And this is a very fraught moment for India's minorities, especially India's Muslims. And I think that time is also something that people feel extremely ginger about and and it's also a kind of an existential crisis in many ways. I often think that the kind of protests people want to make in public about the violence in Gaza, and we've not been allowed to do that anywhere in this country, except perhaps Tamil Nadu, where we had a protest 1 month ago. Gaza is also an alibi for the suffering that cannot be named in this country. And that, I think, is such a betrayal of the Republic in a fundamental sense. So I think that time is also something that you see around you now. And then, of course, there is this whole sort of culture of resentment and hatred. I mean, I don't have to tell you much about it. Anyone who heard the Independence Day speech given by the Prime Minister yesterday knows how we are remembering 1947 through invocations of othering and hatred. And that is, again, a source of great bother for many of us, because it's sort of shaping our responses too in some ways, because it has set the terms of debate. So we are reacting in ways that are equally sort of assertive, if not violent sometimes, in our speech. And that, I think, is their triumph also. So what is this time? Is it that Brahmanical Hinduism has never gone away? Has it never been challenged, that it can marshal everything from the past to convey hatred? And here I'm reminded of what K. Balagopal once wrote, that to invoke the Manusmriti doesn't mean that you have to go back to medieval times, because the Manusmriti has never died in this country. Its tenets inform the criminal justice system in very fundamental ways. Not in terms of people knowing the Manusmriti and therefore acting, but that our understanding of justice itself is shaped by a culture that echoes what the Manusmriti says. So in that sense, you also wonder again about time. What is this time we are living in, and how does one make sense of it? And finally, I think one of the things in terms of which we all feel dismayed is the growing economic inequality in this country, so evident everywhere, and the shameless ways in which capital is being coddled, basically, not even nurtured. It's being coddled, and there's such indulgence that's shown towards obviously lawbreakers who have a lot of money. So that is also for many of us a betrayal of the Nehruvian notion of whatever attenuated form of the welfare state we had, whatever we've been able to get from the government of India by way of ameliorative action, the food distribution system, some kind of a public health service, free education. Many of these things have gone into crisis, as we know. But equally, the coddling of the rich. I mean, I don't think the rich invoke so much affection and support in most cultures. There may be horribly rich people elsewhere too, but there's usually a subculture which sees poverty as virtuous and wealth as a crime. But we worship wealth. We worship wealth in a very fundamental sense, and that worship has acquired a certain menacing overtone. And you wonder what happened to Nehruvian socialism, or what happened to socialism itself. And I think since it's been very hard for us to retain any vision of revolution that was very central to many of our own political understanding in the 70s, 80s, and even 90s, and the very problematic revolutionary record of states where revolution happened, whether it's China, whether it's the Soviet Union, or smaller countries even, like, say, Nicaragua, or even neighboring Nepal. It's a mixed record, and somewhere we're not able to sort of grasp that mixed nature of that record. And so if you don't have a movement towards revolution, then what do you do with distributive justice? How do you understand the economy? Not that one must go back to the revolution, but basically there's that problem as well. So we are left with this sense of a time being out of joint in several spheres of our life. I just want to spend the rest of my talk thinking about how have we made sense of this. And I think that's an interesting thing to ask ourselves, because we have made sense of it and we have responded with dignity and grace in whatever fields that we are working in, media, the law courts, small groups, protests on the streets. I think there's been a continuous sense of dissidence as well. Or in prison, there's been a lot of protests coming from within prison walls. So all of that is there. But to sort of be very schematic about this, let me just sort of say how we've perhaps dealt with this. Take the whole question of, this culture of India, and these are the terms set by the ruling dispensation, right? Much of what we have discussed is unfolding within a context where the terms of debate are already set. So what are the terms of this debate? That this is a Hindu nation, or it has got to be a Hindu nation, right? That's one thing that is constantly being dinned into our heads in different ways. And our response has been no. this cannot be a Hindu nation. Look at the constitution. This can only be a secular nation. That's one way of thinking about how do we deal with this question. Fudging happens. Those who claim national sovereignty is important constantly equate sovereignty with security. It's always about security. It's always about saying we are in danger from X, Y, Z. It's always about creating enclaves of possible enemies within the country and outside the country. Now to federalism. Both governments, the CPM government in Kerala and the DMK government in Tamil Nadu have been affirming that this is a federal polity. Again, I'm going to quote Balgopal because he often spoke of what an imperfect had any traction in Indian polity except in Tamil Nadu and perhaps in parts of the Northeast. But their federalism was not federalism, it was the right to self-determination rather than federalism. But that's another way in which we have addressed this question in terms of unity and so on. And when it comes to this whole culture of resentment, to what some writers have called Brahmanical fascism, the Hindu fascism, the return of the caste order in different ways. And our response has been, no, we really need to sort of look at this as a very diverse culture, that we have to account for difference, allow for the fact that we can't all be accommodated within this caste order. That's not what this is all about. You can't accommodate people, we need equality. And the constitution is again being invoked. Description of how many of us as concerned citizens have responded to this present moment. Now I want to come back to Hamlet, because one of the things is that if you've read the play, Hamlet does not avenge his father's death, as you know, he dies. Nietzsche said that Hamlet cannot act, but Hamlet finds a way of talking which is not the language of logic, which is not the language of politics. Instead, it's a language of tangential expression, not making a case for deliberate sort of, expressions of unreason. That's not what I'm saying. But there are ways in which perhaps there are tangential ways in which one can actually respond to the present. And what may these be? So I want to take each of these points and then sort of go through them. So the first thing is about this is a Hindu nation. Now what do we do with this fact? This is a Hindu nation is being directed almost exclusively against Muslims, in some places against Christians. But perhaps we should revisit the terms on which Muslims were included in this polity. I think that's a very important question to ask as well. And the terms of inclusion were never equal. The Constitution guarantees rights. There are fundamental rights that are granted to minorities, but the conditions for citizenship have been very daunting and very punitive from the very beginning. And you see it in different ways, of course. But for me, as a feminist, the most obvious manner in which that was established was the Abduction of Women and Recovery Act that the Indian government passed in 1948. Or 49, Kalpana? 48 or 49? 48. 48. And basically this was that all the Hindu women abducted by Muslim men, Sikh women abducted by Muslim men, taken to Pakistan, should be brought back, never mind what they wish to do with their lives, never mind if they have children. Likewise, the state of Pakistan also said, bring back the Muslim women. So you had a very visceral mapping of borders on women's bodies. Completely. Those bodies were the borders of this nation. And it's frightening because where does that leave the woman citizen then? And mind you, all of this is happening when the Constituent Assembly is discussing the Constitution, when fundamental rights are being discussed. In the legislative wing, the Hindu Code Bill is being discussed. Never have women's rights been in the forefront as they were at that moment in time. But what was happening at the moment of partition was that this sort of abduction and violence had taken place. And how did the government seek to resolve this problem? By claiming that Hindu women should only bear the children of Hindus. So if they have children, they should leave them behind in Pakistan, because we don't want children that carry Muslim DNA, the imprint of a Muslim. And likewise, Pakistan. Now, the implications of this is something we are still living with again and again in any kind of communal violence. This is what we see. And as we saw in Gujarat 2002, with in a consistent manner, this was done. And this is a logic that repeats itself in any sort of national situation, as we saw in Manipur some months ago. So I think this whole sense of the Indian nation as something that is a secular nation, it guarantees fundamental rights. I'm not disputing that, and I'm not being cynical about the Constitution. But let's remember that at the same time, women were being inserted into citizenship in very peculiar ways, and which are still with us as far as the rights of minority women are concerned, or in some ways all women are concerned. Because even when a death like the one I described in Tamil Nadu happens, borders are being drawn. And if a woman's claim to citizenship can only be through her reproductive function, who she should sleep with, who she should marry, who she should have children with, what happens to fundamental rights then? And this is something I think we need to think about. And it's a logic that we haven't nearly fully addressed at all times. I think this is a very important aspect of how we became a nation. Now, starting from there, you also have a tendency to test Muslims. And this is something also we need to think about. While the present day dispensation trusts to bulldozing, there has been a constant testing of Muslim loyalty from 1947 onwards. I can only speak what I know from my own home state, which has not been inimical to Muslim rights. Muslims have identified with the Dravidian movement by and large. But even then, the Muslim League and other Muslim groups, which were part of the Dravidian movement, went silent because any claims of being part of the Dravidian movement would stamp them with wanting secession. Then they would be immediately identified with the Pakistani cause. So you're constantly being tested, and the testing may not be overt, it may not even be political. It may be something as harmless as the banter we trade during a cricket match. Who will you support? But as we know from the history of hate speech, when does a joke cease to be a joke? And there's this very interesting book called Stettel by a Polish woman called Eva Hoffman. And she writes about the Polish anti-Semitism in Poland. And she speaks of how, when is a joke a joke? When does a joke become a threat? When does a threat become an act of violence? When does an act of violence has the endorsement of the state? And one can't say that, these can be anticipated or foretold. You can't say, oh, it's a joke, nothing will ever come of it. So that constant testing that you see across India in different ways, the charges of disloyalty that are so easily made, these are very problematic and very frightening. And this is where I feel it gets very important to think of countering Hindu India by detaching the Muslim question from the national question. Constantly folding it back into the history of the nation makes Muslims only visible to us as either loyal subjects or disloyal subjects. Or as Mahmoud Mamdani said, good Muslim or bad Muslim. So how do you not do that? I think personally that one way is to perhaps engage with this question is to recognize the irreducible particularity of Indian Muslims. That they are not a national population so much as they are a population of people who live by the Islamic faith, but live in diverse ways, in different contexts, with very rich and layered histories of the encounter between Islam and whatever they found in the subcontinent. And I think those histories are very important, more than ever, to place in the forefront now, because that's the way we have coexisted. We have not coexisted in terms of national identities. We have coexisted in particular geographies, doing particular things, engaging with each other in different ways. Sure, we were part of larger networks. But I think it's the particularity of Islam that has sustained it also. The forms it has taken in the subcontinent. And I don't have to say more. Dakkani Islam is very different from what you get in northwestern India. The language is different, the cultures are different, everything is different. And I think, how might we engage with this? And I was very moved when some history of the police action and what it has left behind, what it has done in this part of the world. And so there's no point in constantly saying secular without also taking into account a number of these issues and not to be cynical at the same time. How might we work with that? I don't want to thumb my nose at everybody who was part of that moment, but I certainly want to have a way of thinking and living with Muslim people. And how do I do that is a question that I think is very important, and this is something that we can all think about together. Then when it comes to this whole business of, nation, the thing that, we're all, one of the things is, just like Muslim citizenship has been fraught, Dalit citizenship has been fraught. In spite of Article 17, in spite of fundamental rights, in spite of the Atrocities Prevention Act, acts of violence continue. Due process of law, Dalits have been anything but violent. Almost all Dalit parties, except when they were part of militant armed left movements, are committed to constitutional remedies. And Ambedkar very famously said back in 1919, when he made a case for why Dalits should represent themselves and not be nominated to the British legislature, he said, Dalits can only represent Dalits for the simple reason untouchability is an experience only they have, right? Others have other kinds of interests that they would like represented in legislature. A merchant will have his interests, a landlord will have interests, labor will have its own interests. But Dalits have very paramount interests because their interests are completely denied, and they have their, and he uses the word, they have their very person confiscated. That's the word he uses. They have their very person confiscated. Engagement with it has been important because the constitution guarantees a certain identity as a citizen with rights-bearing citizen. But at the same time, it's been an ineffective constitution. This is not that people give up on the constitution, but it's not been a particularly effective constitution. And I don't mind repeating what Anand Teltunde told me on his return from prison. I wrote an imaginary letter to Baba Saheb when I was in prison saying, your constitution got me into prison. It was a joke, of course, in some ways, but it's also not a joke. But I think the point is then, how might we think of the constitution? And I think to think of the constitution, I think today we see that it's being completely sort of mangled through acts of terror and violence. But in this city, again, I don't need to remind any of you the long history of civil liberties in Andhra Pradesh, Telangana, and their documentation of how these rights have been systematically eroded in every decade of the republic's existence, more than any other state. It has been recorded, documented, people have gone to court. And why is it that the present moment is seen as exceptional? So what is the relationship between the everyday and the exceptional? The everyday things that Dalits face, the exceptional moment that we are in, and then the continuous sort of, derogation of rights that we see whenever there are protests. And this, I think we need to also think a little more about how do we then think of sovereignty itself. Because what is at stake is that each one of our cells is being folded into a security apparatus. Surveillance is the name of the game. And we are all being made hostage to a security conscious state. And the thing is not to just say constitution, but to think of very specific ways in which we have engaged and succeeded in our engagement with the constitution. What have Dalits succeeded? What have civil liberties movements achieved? And I think these histories are very important. And the Dalit faith in the constitution cannot simply be because Ambedkar gave us the constitution. They have worked the constitution in interesting ways. So what is that jurisprudence? How do you talk about it? And I think these should be part of a larger conversation about challenging this sort of nation madness that we have around us, this securitized nation that we have around us, and equally to challenge national worship. Never have we worshipped the nation as we worship it now. And I think of this very interesting quote by Periyar back in the late 20s, where he says, nationalism is our new religion. And once you adopt it as a religion, it allows you to do anything in its name. Every kind of deception, every kind of dissembling, and every act of lying. And he says that again and again. He says that here, he says that when he goes to Sri Lanka. And in fact, he constantly says that how nationalism is really the last refuge of every political scoundrel. And he repeats it in different ways and in different contexts. And I think there is all of this way of thinking about nationalism also that were part of public debate, that were discussed widely. And I think these are things that we can come back to and rethink. And the other thing about this thing on national unity, federalism, of course, has been democratic polity invested in equality or social justice, as long as you don't sort of constantly revise your understanding of federalism. So in Tamil Nadu, for example, again, a lot of people might not agree with me, but having lived nowhere else but Tamil Nadu all my life, what I see happening right now is a kind of a opposition to the unitary Indian state and to Hindutva in terms of the Dravidian model. You're all familiar with it. Our chief minister made a speech even yesterday on the Dravidian model on Independence Day. But the point is, the claims being made for the Dravidian model, in their manner of how they are said, not the content, the manner that they are put forth, they're exactly like the claims being made for a unified Indian nation, that you can't doubt either of these things. It is that complete closing of debate that is worrying. Because there's been critique of the Dravidian model from feminists, from Dalits, and from civil liberties groups. So without taking on board any of these things and revising your understanding of federalism, you constantly invoke a certain political alternative, then that alternative was not credible beyond a point. And but this is what I meant, because Hindutva has set the terms of debate, the response to it is mirrors it in some ways, not in content but in its form. And forms are very important in politics, how you say something, the words that you use, and this disallowing of reflexive thought, of thinking on the subject. How might it help us challenge unitary India? This is a question we need to ask. If our defenses or if our challenges are not ethically or politically or socially reflexive and willing to be open to debate, then we are going to replicate something which, in terms of how you say it's important, is exactly the same. In fact, just as how the buck stops at the Prime Minister's office, the buck stops at the Chief Minister's office in Tamil Nadu. That's not good for democracy. There are processes, there are means through which things should be done, and a lot of lying happens. Data is being fudged, wild claims are being made about things. So I think these are all things that are equally worrying. I mean, and this is what I mean. And how else do you talk about federalism? And I think here again, for me at least, what I find very important and interesting is not to direct all our conversations at Delhi. Why should Delhi hog our imagination? We can talk to each other, no? There's so much that we can benefit by illuminating each other, especially the 4 southern states, and perhaps other states as well. Because in pre-independent India, if you look at the literature of that time, you do see states following provinces as they were at that time, picking up from each other. So you would have somebody in Maharashtra reporting on what was going on in the deep south. And as this morning, I heard from Deepak here how in the kind of anti-caste Hindi journalism of that time, there were references to things that were happening in the south. So, temple entry movement, for example, in the old state of Travancore and Cochin. So it's a way in which we've lost that. States are just sort of looking at each other, trying to sort of say, I want water, I won't give you this, I won't give you that. We're replicating that whole model of centralized control. A polity should be a union of Indian states in the genuine sense, like say, the European Union without capitalism. And I don't know if that's possible, but in any case, where there are shared cultures, shared histories, and those histories are so important. We've shared so much. We've learned so much, picked up from each other. We don't need the mediation of a centralized state to coexist. Coexistence need not be at the cost of diversity or picking up, coexistence is different from a forced unity. And I think that is something that we can go back to our histories and relook some of these things. And then last but not the least, 2 aspects, the economy. And this is something I think we really need to look at, because one of the things that at least the left constantly says is the rollback of the public sector. But let's face it, the public sector accounted for less than 1% of the country's economy, even at the best of times. And the record of the public sector is not pretty. There's been really important work done by sociologists and historians on how public sector units actually functioned in real life. And 2 excellent books, one on the Bhilai steel plant, for example. So who got those jobs? Did the local Adivasis and Dalits get jobs? Who got what job? So the public sector units ran an economy which retained the structure of the caste system. Which retained it. So casual, contract, permanent labor, if you see that as a hierarchy, you will see that permanent labor was skilled factory labor, mostly drawn from places outside the geography it was located. This is something that Arun Patnaik has demonstrated for the Rourkela steel plant, that Jonathan Parry has demonstrated for the Bhilai steel plant. And we in Tamil Nadu have been going on about the Neyveli Lignite Corporation. So the local economies, especially Bahujan Dalit Adivasi communities, have not benefited from any of these things. And they are inserted into this public sector economy as contract and casual workers. And and you can see this in, say, all these public sector units have townships, no? The relationship between the township and the regular urban squatters, colonies that you find in any of these places. Visually, you can see the difference. So I think this whole romanticization of the public sector, one should take a hard-headed look at it. What has the public sector done? What has it not done? not being cynical again, but it has obviously benefited in some ways. But it's also, especially as India's Adivasi population is concerned, it's been extremely sort of, their rights have been derogated in ways we haven't even fully mapped out yet. And Ranjana Padi and Nigamanand Sadangi have done this mapping for Odisha brilliantly, starting from the Hirakud Dam project, saying who lost and who won in all these public sector companies that have emerged over a period of time. So again, it's not that we have answers, but I think this nostalgia for Nehruvian socialism ought to be sort of really some hard-headed critique of what it built on is important. We have not dismantled the caste labor nexus in this country. Caste may not be performing so-called traditional occupations, but caste still perform occupations based on the hierarchy and where they find themselves in the hierarchy. And I think that's something that Ambedkar again spoke of, actually sells her or his labor in a potentially, but not really free market. Whereas a caste worker has no choice. You're just stuck with what you're doing. You're immobile. So I think in that sense, he said, you can't have a proletarian consciousness in this country when the caste worker who has become a wage worker retains caste consciousness. And the wage doesn't do much because much of the wage is paid to you if you're a Bahujan or a Dalit are nowhere close to what would help you lead a life of fulfillment. So, there have been all these critiques and all of this. And I think that here I don't have anything to add by way of how else we might think, except that we may want to sort of stop romanticizing the public sector over much while insisting on union rights, while insisting on all the things that we want for ourselves. This is not to say that state should not be doing things, but the state cannot expect to do things in this manner and then say that if this is dismantled, something terrible will happen. The state is always built on an existing economic framework, social framework. There have been gains and losses, but the losses have been more than the gains. And for the Adivasi population, it has meant a lot of heartbreak and suffering. So this is one thing. The last thing, Brahmanical fascism, Hindutva fascism, whatever we call it. We've all been concerned, we've all been railing against it, writing against it. I think the number of books on Hindutva fascism that have come out the last few years are more than what have come out in the past. But what I find quite interesting and curious about this writing is, while it gets all the facts right and it rightly targets Hindutva's acts of impunity, it does not quite draw from the literature of the anti-caste movement, which I find very interesting. Whether it's Akar Patel's book, except perhaps Christophe Jaffrelais, but even he doesn't draw on the anti-caste movement. I say this because the anti-caste movement has had almost a 200-year history of thinking about caste, if not more, depending on the regions we come from. And their learnings, we can quarrel with them, we may say we don't agree, but we're not engaging with those learnings. And those learnings are very important. Some of them make a very simplistic sort of equation between Hinduism and Hindutva. Some of them say, no, that's far too simple. But I think the core of anti-caste thought helps us understand what Ambedkar called the Hindu social order. And I think it's important to see it as a Hindu social order and not simply as a secular hierarchy. Now, you don't have to get into the quarrel of whether religion is responsible or occupations are responsible or it was a class division of labor that then became a caste. These are debates we can continue to have. But the point is, this is a hierarchical system. And as Ambedkar said, this is a hierarchy where there's no possibility of equality. You only have graded inequality. As you grow up the caste ladder, you experience reverence. As you come down, you experience contempt. Dalits are placed outside this whole system, this triangle. As he said, they're denied their humanity. Their self is confiscated. And he says much of this is held in place because we think inequality is sacred, that it is defined in the scriptures as such. Now, as scholars of religion, you can argue it is not so. There is much that is also not understood as such. But beyond what scholarship says, beyond what the text of religion says, are the practices of society, right? And there you have a sense where this hierarchy has constantly reinvented itself, one way or the other, and kept the graded logic in place. That gradedness has not gone away at all. Whatever you do, you can shuffle. The cards can be shuffled any which way. Somebody who was at the bottom may find themselves in the middle. But whoever is at the top and the bottom remain at the top and bottom. The middle can be shuffled. And this is our problem with caste, because and it was Ambedkar's problem also. How do you convince the huge swath of Bahujan communities that caste is against their interest as well? They find it easy to be anti-Brahmanical, but can they be anti-caste as well? This is a challenge that Ambedkar faced all his life. This is a challenge the Dravidian movement faces in Tamil Nadu. So how do you convince them that this is compromising for you as well? If you read the introduction to Who Were the Shudras, that's what he says. I wrote this book to convey to my Shudra friends that they have a fundamental interest in challenging caste, and if they don't challenge it, they are actually compromising their own selfhood. But this is a problem of political economy also. Who gets to do what, how the working class is divided, how sections of the so-called Shudra communities are landed. They have huge amounts of land. Many of them have accessed political power in this country today. So how do you understand that? And here, anti-caste literature is important. There's no point in saying Hindutva is dividing us. We are divided. Hindutva doesn't have to divide any of us. But for example, when the subcategorization of Dalits came up, and Andhra, of course, Andhra Telangana set the trend in this with the Madiga reservation thing. And Tamil Nadu followed by offering a special quota for the Arundhatiyars. A lot of Dalit groups across the country felt that this was a ploy on the part of Hindutva to divide Dalits. Now, it would be more interesting to say in our regions, how has this panned out? Is it division everywhere? Let's take Maharashtra. Mahars and Mangs are divided. Neo-Buddhists are mostly Mahars. Let's take Uttar Pradesh. The Chamars hold a certain hegemonic clout, other communities don't hold. Let's take Tamil Nadu. The Pallars and Parayars have hegemony, whereas number of smaller castes don't have. I'm not saying hegemony in an overall sense, within the sphere of what we consider the scheduled castes. So clearly there's a logic here that we need to understand, and anti-caste thoughts alerts us to this logic, that this is something that cuts through the caste system. And we need to keep that in mind as we think about, otherwise we end up with very easy formulations about Hindutva dividing us. And this is what we keep saying, oh, but they have accommodated any number of, because you read all these CSDS type of reports, that's the kind of analysis you get. They have adapted this caste, they have done this to get someone in here, sure. But how is that possible? Why does it work? Because people have aspirations, they are real life aspirations. And if a polity is going to fulfill those aspirations, people will agree. And nobody is going to wait for an ideal anti-caste future to better their lives. But there is also no vision of an anti-caste future that's part of our polity, right? That's the thing. That's what Periyar and Ambedkar and many others kept alive for a long time. But the discussions veer into particularities, veer into things that don't really let us challenge the centrality, which is that the Hindu social order is something that believes in inequality as if it was sacred. And why? And we can understand this in different ways. Ambedkar in different places says that it's sacred, but he also says it's mental habitude, it's social habit. He also was struggling to understand why does it persist. So Periyar put it down to Brahmanical chickenry. And we could think of many reasons why it has persisted, but the fact is they are not central to our conversations about challenging Brahmanical fascism. The challenge is always that the fascist part are not enough about the Brahmanical part. So, but they are wedded in India, no, in a very interesting way. They're both linked. And this is not only Ambedkar and Periyar who said it. Another thinker who said it was M.N. Roy, very early on. And in some of his more inspired movements, S.A. Dange, back in the 1920s, he became uninspired later on, but in his early inspired moments, he actually said this also. So I think these are some things that perhaps we can keep our minds open to. So I just conclude by saying that time is out of joint, yes, but there are different times and different temporalities of struggle in this country. Anti-caste movements, the feminist movements, our critiques of labor and caste, things that we need to learn from the conditions of citizenship, which I think is very, very important today. And not to simply say that they're doing this to Muslims, but we've always done this to Muslims in different ways. Maybe it was not so horrible, maybe it was not so systematic, maybe it was disaggregated. But we really need to again come back to that question of so what? If what is his point about disloyalty? That the whole business of disloyalty has to completely be brought to the upfront in much more sort of strong ways, not by simply throwing it in Hindutva's face, but also in terms of how we've lived together and rich traditions of living together. Not just an invocation of cultural forms, but also everyday reciprocities, everyday quarrels, everyday acts of, affection or anger or whatever it is. Living together means all of that. So I think is a very, very crucial thing. So I'll stop with this, and thanks for hearing.
Deal with the caste inequalities, and maybe everything couldn't be done at the same time. We were recovering from partition, there's all this, whatever, the country was in a mess. However, the public sector in the initial Nehruvian period was an extremely prerequisite for undertaking investments where private sector would not have gone, and it provided that prerequisite for later on the private sector to take on from there. I mean, investments into electricity, into irrigation, etc., they probably would not have been very profitable. And private capital will obviously, as we are all aware, will be determined by the rate of return. So I think to downplay that purely on grounds of that it will not address the employment discrimination. So I think one would need to kind of balance it with that. The second point is about the mainstream attitude towards Muslims. But I think we also need to look at the attitudes, not the attitudes, but the kind of psyche that has been perforce, that at least I notice, and I'll give you a few instances, coming from the Muslim community. Recently, there was a post that there's a favorable judgment. Now, Urdu we are language of Muslims, and here the progressives are trying to say it's not. And I agree, it's not. There was a judgment of Supreme Court in Blue Police, where somebody had said, this is a Hindi poster, इसमें Urdu में क्यों लिखा है? So this guy goes to Supreme Court, and Supreme Court gives a favorable judgment in support of Urdu, that Urdu is a national language. I mean, it is born in India, etc. So it's perfectly legitimate and allowed. Now, this favorable judgment on Urdu is celebrated by the local Muslims as a Muslim victory, and they are thanking Allah for it and all. This I have noticed even very often. I'm part of a small group in Hyderabad, a very interesting group on Urdu Nasr prose, because everybody talks of Shairi. Shairi is more attractive and so on and so forth. I'm the only non-Muslim there. Everybody. Now, in that WhatsApp group, the dominant, the ideology of that group has become that it is Muslim, it's a Muslim group, and they will start posting religious posts over there. Which really are the efforts, the activities of the group are excellent. They are coming out with brilliant Urdu literature. But the members over there, which is, they are not able to come out of that mindset of that Muslim identity is very, the religious identity is weighing so strongly on them. And I think I went to Kashmir 3 years ago, I noticed that there. There's a recoiling of the Muslim community into which I think, I'm not saying it's good or bad or right or wrong. My question is that isn't it damaging the interest of the Muslim community by this kind of a reaction to the Muslim community? It's not a question of being judging anyone, but I think I feel bad that they are damaging their own face. And I've seen this in many situations.
Yeah.
I would say the thing about the Muslim taking ownership of Urdu, perhaps that's the only way Urdu could survive in a way. I don't know. Considering what the nation is going through at the moment, I feel that this could be a kind of a solution.
Just let me intervene. I think it will reinforce.
Why don't we just, maybe you can.
I was actually, as you were speaking, I was wondering if and where sort of engagement with colonialism and post-colonial states, if at all exists on the horizon. And partly this is prompted by reflections on what is happening in Gaza and the sort of response to that in the Indian world politics, right? So there's some would argue a deliberate attempt to misinterpret it as a religious conflict. But for a vast majority of people, it's also sort of a genuine lack of understanding of it as, colonialism or settler-colonialism. So, I was just wondering, in all that you were thinking, how does, because when you think about sort of some of the post-colonial vocabulary on the left and how it has been appropriated by the right now, when you're thinking about that in terms of how we think of our times and respond to it.
Yeah, sure.
And one non-clarity. The clarity question, or rather, I would like you to elucidate more. You spoke about this Polish writers, when is a joke not a joke? I thought that was very interesting. If you could give us a little more on that. What and the other the difference between security and sovereignty. If you could just elucidate a little more what you mean by sovereignty, that would be great. The non-clarity question I had is you spoke about how, in a sense, I'm being a devil's advocate. You spoke about how words are important, how we speak is important. But you also said that worship, in India we worship well, while poverty is we worship. Would not someone say that worshipping wealth is worshipping Lakshmi? And that's a very Hindu thing. And worshipping poverty seems a more Christian thing, that the weak will inherit the earth. And is that, I don't know, is that kind of a discourse problematic?
Right.
Easy pickings for people who oppose this.
Thank you. From power, that it has to do with authority and violence and so on. And much of in parts of the world, that has been attributed to a Protestant critique of wealth itself in some contexts. But we also have local traditions of critiquing wealth, which we have sufficiently not foregrounded. Voluntary poverty is also a Buddhist value, at least in an ideal sense, ideal normative sense. So is asceticism. The Parivrajika is not supposed to own anything. So when I said that we need to think about inequality in fundamental ways, this is not to counterpose the worship of Lakshmi with a Protestant ethic, but to also ask ourselves, why is it not a problem that wealth and power go together? And again, this is not to say that one mustn't lead a fulfilling good life with enough to see us flourish as human beings. That's very important also in a poor and unequal society. But I think there's a more fundamental comfort we have with wealth, which I find deeply worrying, because there is such a resurgence of a certain kind of a consumer ethic, which is wedded to the kind of relentless capitalism we see today. And in most parts of the world, movements against that sort of an ethic have been always millenarian, starting with the critique of wealth itself. Whether it's the 14th century peasants' revolt in Europe, whether it's the 19th century utopian socialists, So I think, have we had anything like that in the Indian context, except Gandhi, which gets problematic because of his association with wealth also. So these are some things that I perhaps should have elucidated better, but this is what I had in mind. The other thing is between sovereignty and security. See, as we know from the Constitution and also from most theories of democracy and the Republic, that the people are sovereign. It's the people of India who gave themselves the Constitution. Though in historical terms, this was a very small section of the people of India, but nevertheless, we spoke in the name of the people of India. But the Indian state doesn't speak in the name of the people of India. It always speaks in the name of the nation's integrity and unity, which then becomes a question of protecting borders through means that separate the population into those who are traditionally considered legitimate citizens and those who cannot be considered citizens. So this is a people's republic is lost sight of, and you have a discourse that replaces it with patriots versus terrorists, or patriotic people versus unpatriotic people, however you define unpatriotism. But the people of India disappear from the picture, and the only movement that kept the people of India at the forefront was a civil liberties movement, because it spoke in name of the rights-bearing people of India. And to some extent, the Dalit and the feminist movements, though Dalit movement also spoke in the name of broad community rights also, rights denied to people because they're part of a certain community. So, and I think what we have today is when we keep on hearing this thing about national integrity, national unity, they sound self-evident virtues. but they are actually virtues that have abducted the notion of the people as sovereign. So how do you bring the people of India back into the discussion? Something we saw during the anti-CAA protests, for example, that citizenship rights are being claimed by the marginal citizens of this country. We see it also in a number of protests across the country in an everyday sense. But these don't add up for us as a nation. We see them as particular protests, and we only see something that challenges this idea of national security as valid. So how do you respond to this claim of integrity of India? Because you can't respond to it in any meaningful way because it comes with such force. So you're forced to be patriotic on their terms and say we are as good patriots as you are. So you will have columnists and say even a thing like The Wire finding fault with India's policy on China and saying the most atrocious things about China, which are ahistorical, just because we want to define ourselves as super patriots at some level. So this is perhaps how can we rethink this and return the discourse back to the people of India, which is very fundamental to the Republic itself. And your first question was? The Polish right. Okay. So this is Eva Hoffman, who's from Poland and who migrated to the United States when she was 16 years old and learned a new language, etc. And she wrote a very important book called Lost in Translation. And then she wrote this thing called Shtetl. Now, Shtetl is the name of a Polish ghetto. I mean, the ghetto in Poland, the Jewish ghetto was called a Shtetl. And so she writes about the history of Polish anti-Semitism. And she starts with this very interesting first chapter where she chronologically traces the kind of anti-Semitism that led to the Holocaust in different parts of Europe. And she talks about how it's not that people don't differentiate themselves or say jokes about each other or have all these funny ways in which they reference. I mean, like our own Sardarji jokes, for example, or jokes about what Muslims like or what Hindus like or this caste likes or that caste likes. Much of this is bantering most of the time. It makes for a certain sociability even. And it allows you to work through contradictions and tensions without too much of a sort of, you don't have to be solemn all the time. But then at certain moments in history, jokes start assuming a certain frightening reality. So if you say that it's a tendency of Jews never to sort of do this, and you say this through a joke, and then you have your municipal corporation making laws which restrict the trading rights of Jews, what happens to the joke? So that joke then becomes something else, becomes slightly menacing. And then that menace then leads to a certain fear, a certain anxiety, And then when it has the endorsement of the state, it becomes something totally different. And she traces that in very interesting ways. And I think it's a very useful thing to keep in mind also. How do you track these things? How do they happen overnight? And what has happened? How does Hindutva acquire normalcy? Not that it only starts with a joke, when she says it for the Polish context. But we may also want to track how the ordinary normal becomes the extraordinary abnormal. And that I think is a useful thing to be doing and saying.
That court, Supreme Court decision, I mean, it's not the Supreme Court, the federal minister who made a very kind of hate speech. And the Supreme Court said that, no, he was just
joking. That's the thing. You can actually do that off very easily, and that is very menacing and frightening. Then coming back to the questions that, your question about post-colonialism and how some of the critiques of colonialism taken up by the far right. Meera Nanda's new book is about all of that, right? But I think it's an interesting question because I think part of the problem, say with Gaza, for example, that people genuinely misunderstand it and so on. It's also, I think, part of the problem with our understanding of colonialism, at least in my view, post-colonialism has tried to build this sort of very strong epistemological and theoretical critique of how colonialism has taken over our entire way of thinking. It is evident in many things that we do and so on. But what it perhaps left out of the reckoning was what we made of colonialism. And we made many things out of colonialism, and this is where the anti-caste movement is very important. The way it worked with colonialism. I mean, at one level it was something as simple as the British Raj is better than Brahman Raj. It can be something as simple as that. But it would also be something like M.N. Roy saying that very much influenced by the French Enlightenment in his own ways. He studied in France, he worked there, he lived there. And there's a lot of interesting recent literature which shows how much he drew from the broader French Republican tradition. But I think what has happened with post-colonialism is it does not do justice to the broader global solidarities of which anti-colonial and anti-caste movements were a part. Both were part of global solidarities. I mean, Ambedkar constantly invokes the struggle in the so-called Negro struggle, as he calls it, in the United States. His early work references work from Africa. And then you have, of course, the broad left working with solidarity movements across the world, anti-colonial movements. So I think that is not part of post-colonial discourse. Once you insert that into the question, it's very evident we are not talking about culture or epistemology alone. And we haven't done that. And part of the problem that we don't get Gaza is because we've forgotten what it meant to be part of the third world, what it meant to be part of the non-aligned movement, what it meant to be having photographs of Tito, Nehru, Nazar on our walls. Our generation knows that this trio was so well known. I mean, it was like we all knew Nazar uncle, but how? It was like it was a moment in which it was being invoked, better for opportune reasons. What can it be? We don't know. But I think that question needs to be asked as well. And I don't know if it's only about employment and labor. It is really about land extraction, development on whose terms. And I think today you have a lot of interesting literature from the Adivasis, which also help us understand that perhaps some people don't want this development in this way. They may have other things that are more important to them. For instance, a left activist, when we were discussing Ranjana's book, he said, but the Adivasis say that the Niyamgiri hills are their grandparents. Surely they mean that as a metaphor. I said they don't. They mean it as a reality. So why can't we stretch our imagination to understand what that means? Why must it be a rational, instrumental reason? Because if that is kin to me, I don't want it destroyed. And I don't want that development. And these are evident in all the things that the people that she spoke to had to say. So I'm just saying that there is all this literature we need to be looking at a little more carefully, because this endless nostalgia does not help us beyond the point. And it remains at the level of nostalgia without taking into account hard-headed analysis. So not everywhere, but in some places. Yeah, there's somebody question at the back. I would respectfully disagree with the way this is being understood, because to me it seems that the folding of Urdu into Muslim identity, I feel it's all right. So if someone is making a claim, it's a claim and we can argue with it. We can say, I'm sorry, but I don't agree with it. It could be that historically we are in a position where it's choiceless. But I also feel the particularities of Islam are something we can quarrel with. But it's a quarrel we can have as coeval people, that I don't agree with you. Periyar did that with Islam all his life. He said Dalits are better off converting to Islam. Now, whether that's true or not, we don't know. But he said that, and then he argued with Muslims all his life. But that was a very interesting argument. It made for an interesting polity. But I think when we say that, Urdu is not to be identified with Islam, I'm sure historically it cannot be. It was a language that was shared widely, used widely. True enough. I have no quarrels with that. And I don't know enough Urdu to say anything else other than what I've read. But I also think that the claims that are being made by Muslims are claims that are being made by a lot of others in different contexts. And for our project of challenging Hindutva, I don't know why that should be so important. That's I don't know. We need to think a bit.
My point was different. That this is
in Tamil Nadu, the history has been different. Deccan has been different. If we dislodge that a little bit and rethink.
That wasn't my question.
No. I know, but the question for me, that's how I understand it. Because if it feeds into Hindutva, let it feed into Hindutva. Let's think of other ways to talk about Muslim lives. Because many things feed into Hindutva. No, they appropriate Ambedkar, they appropriate everybody that they wish to. But for me, I
feel it is divisive. That was my point.
But we are divided. No, that's my point.
We are. But the point is, as progressives, we are.
But as progressives, we can also think of whether divisions are always negative. Divisions can also be the basis for interesting conversations, for disagreements, for saying that, look, it's like what I learned from the Dalit feminist Ruth Manorama. She often would say, you feminists, you haven't addressed the caste question. She'd scold us, berate us, then she'd say, come home and have a meal. There's a way in which I think there are ways in which divisions can be thought through and or acknowledged or not acknowledged. But I don't know if, personally, I feel centering Hindutva also gives it a prominence it need not have in our long civilizational history. I think. I may be wrong because I live in a state where it's not, the outcomes are, but I'm just saying that could also be the case. But I would like to sort of just leave it there for now. Yeah. Yes.
questions. They are very fundamental. One is that instead of truly democratic framework which addresses the issues of Dalit, marginalized, and Adivasis, or it is still at the whims and fancies of the political masters or the power center. That's one. The second one is how does the rise or maybe the resurgence of the religious nationalism intersect with gender as well as caste oppression? So your thoughts on that? Thank you.
Example, who for me is very central to an understanding of democracy in the Indian context. He did envisage the possibility of a democratic framework accommodating the rights of Dalits, certainly. The Adivasi question was a little more ambiguous for various reasons, which require a longer discussion. But certainly on the question of Dalits, he felt that democracy has to be, first of all, seen as more than a political system. In the Indian context, democracy has also got to translate into a way of living together. And how do you live together? Law and the constitution can guarantee certain fundamental minimum and necessary conditions for coexistence. That you can't not, I mean, of course, it's a lot of bother, but you can't say, this is a Brahmin street, you can't live here. You can, of course, go to court and fight, that's a bother. But the problem is, it gives normative worth to that statement. If I say that I can live here even if it's a Brahmin street, that's because my constitution allows me to do so. It's a right that I have earned by being a member of this democratic republic. Now, but Ambedkar's problem was that's not enough. Because obviously, you'll have to go to court and your judge might think exactly as your Brahmin neighbor saying that this will create a law and order problem. He'll use a different language, basically. So for Ambedkar, therefore, democracy has also to be translated into a desire to coexist, fraternity as he called it. But there he felt you cannot legislate affection, social affection. 1928, when he deposed before the Simon Commission, you had Clement Attlee, subsequent Prime Minister of the UK, ask him, but Dalits are part of the labor force. Can't you subsume their rights within the rights of labor? He said no, because labor is also divided on the lines of caste. And then he went on to say that, look, what we are asking are for laws and rules that will make it difficult for people to treat us as less than human. But I cannot make my neighbor love me through an act of legislature. That can only emerge through ways of living together that we forge as a society. And for that, we need to rethink how we stand with relationship to each other. And that, there, for him, democracy becomes a way of life. And how does that come about? It could come about through shared spaces, shared struggles sometimes, but through also becoming part of a body where touch ceases to be important, where you can actually intermarry, love across binaries of caste and religion and so on. So all these things matter to him. But ultimately for himself, he chose a way out, saying that the only fraternal society I can think of is one away from the Hindus. The Hindus have no interest in fraternity or democracy. Again, we can ask if that is valid or true, but he was so convinced that he had struggled with this question for the best part of his public life. He is not interested in talking to the Hindus anymore. Let us form our own fraternal society and let us see if we can set a precedent for others to follow. Hence the conversion to Buddhism. The conversion was an invitation to all, not simply the Dalits. So I think there is something to be learnt there as well. I'm not saying this is a solution, nor did Ambedkar see it as an ultimate solution. But I think how do you translate democracy into a way of life was very crucial for him. How do you translate rights into social affection? And he felt rights cannot be sustained without social affection. I have to bear your pain as you bear it to go and speak on your behalf in the court. And that is what civil liberties movements do. That is what public hearings try to achieve. That's what feminist groups have done. So that's where I would leave that question. And the other thing was the religious question, the religious nationalism and caste and gender. See, when nationalism becomes a religion, in whatever manner, and it's always a historical religion, when it claims that this is how Hindus have been for 5,000, 10,000, 15,000 years, whatever the number of years that people claim, it's also talking about the present basically. And much of that religious obsession with the nation, that nationalism is a new religion. See, we think that they want a Hindu nation. But for them, nationalism itself is also a religion. I think we have two aspects here. And in both aspects, gender and caste are connected in very important ways. Because when they're talking about Hindu India, what is your take on the caste question is an immediate question. And the caste question is equally a gender question. So, which is why I think Dalit groups and many other democratic groups have been challenging this, making students read Manusmriti or the Uniform Civil Code and saying that this is really inimical to the rights of women, to the rights of the Bahujan Dalit communities and so on. So, this is at one level, people have been saying it. But when nationalism becomes a religion, all of us suffer in fundamental ways, because basically the only loyalty that is valued when you go to the polls or when you want to avail of government schemes or in any manner that you want the nation to look at you, and here the nation is a nation state, then nationalism becomes a religion and it becomes a cult that people, I mean, and this is a cult really. And you see it take over families, you see it take over communities. People who should know better talk in ways that this is so sacred, I can't talk about this any differently. And there, I think gender and caste and much else are completely sort of central, because nothing is to be questioned, no? Whether it's your take on what you will do with the rights of female wrestlers who want freedom from sexual harassment, or of Dalits wanting claims, or of Muslims wanting rights to worship in a mosque that's historically been a mosque for the last 500 years. All of these are subsumed under the national interest. And the national interest is so sacrosanct. What do you do? Anything from holding a protest against what is going on in Gaza, or from wanting cows off the road, can be seen as inimical to the national interest and therefore inimical to, you're hurting somebody's feelings. Look at the language here. It's always about hurting someone's feelings. So what? We can all live with hurt feelings, provided we can talk about them. No. Why are feelings so sacrosanct? I mean, so I think these are the ways in which they've converted nationalism into a religion. And that is an even more problematic thing, I think.
We have still more questions there. And it's very refined in many ways. How do we take some of this rich thinking and these deliberations to people who hold powerful positions like the government? I mean, we do have many women leaders in government, but clearly replacing men with women who think exactly like them is not the solution. You have to do things differently. I mean, look at the reaction, the callous reaction of even women leaders on, whether it was Prajwal Ravena or, Nirmaya or, the wrestlers. I mean, no response, no reaction. So how do we take this wonderful thinking, this feminist framework, which is homegrown, which is so customized to our realities, unless it reaches people who have power? So basically, how do we bridge this gap? Because a lot of what people like you would say would be totally unintelligible, and they would not even understand what we are trying to say to them. So how do we bridge this gap? Because if you don't think about bridging this gap, it is going to just be like these two separate worlds, and we will just keep dealing with people who hate feminists, people who think feminists, continue to dictate horrible. So, any thoughts on how can you bridge this gap?
The thing is, see, we've had productive conversations with the state. It's not that we've never had. Dalits and feminists have had productive conversations with the state. We have an investment in the state making better laws and enforcing laws that we have asked for. I mean, none of these laws has come about because the state wanted to do anything for us. Again and again, Balgopal would remind us that we, as people's movements, demanded those laws and they had to meet us halfway. And they meet us quarter way most of the time. But that is in the nature of the state itself. No, the nature of state power is it will accommodate some of your concerns, but in ways that will not fundamentally challenge the discretionary power of the state itself. That's something that we all work with. We know that's how it is. So any change in law, for example, or for certain kinds of special interventions, like for instance, the all women's police stations that emerged in Tamil Nadu at one point and then was taken up by various other states. And we've asked for it, we've argued with the state, we've got some things from it in return. But it is also that the state retains its discretion most of the time. So you win some things and then you spend the rest of your life making sure that those wins stay in place. That's the nature of your relationship to the state. It is not a state that thinks of us as co-sharers in its sovereignty, thinks that it stands above us. It defends a notional entity called the nation with its own integrity and borders, which has nothing to do with us. That's how the state behaves. So I think there is that problem. But how do we reach it to people in power? But people in power will only react in certain ways. And I think I am also the wrong person to be answering this question, because I think I have the soul of an anarchist. I've never trusted state power. Though I keep being very responsible most of the time, my soul doesn't ever trust state power. And which is why I'm also uneasy with the left. All these powerful states frighten me. Whether it's a Stalinist state or the Maoist state or any state for that matter. So I think we need to have a sort of very clear-cut sense of the state, what the state will do and will not do. Not stop addressing the state, but also not expect it to do anything beyond the point. And women leaders, as you very well said, they don't have to make a difference, because we are not just women. We are women from a certain community, a certain caste, a certain class, certain politics. We are not feminists. We think feminists are, as you said, wicked, wild, and horrible. So there is all of that also, no? So I think that is a wager that we risk with the state, but we'll keep doing what we think we should be doing, and we must do, because this is a democracy we have built. They haven't handed it out to us on a platter. So I'll take that position, I think.
Of the values that were central to this country's foundational moments, like inclusivity, pluralism, formal constitutionalism, and these values which were, very central to the country's founding moments, and their limitations you have chalked out. I'm interested in the Hindutva's relation to these values. As we know, at that foundational moment, they were quite hostile to these, and we have seen over time this relation becoming less hostile, and they have been able to accommodate these values in certain ways, maybe in perverse ways, of course. But how do we understand Hindutva's reckoning with these values, and what does it tell about? Of course, most of your talk is about what does it tell about these values that Hindutva is able to accommodate in certain ways. But what does it also tell about Hindutva that it is able to accommodate these things in certain registers?
See, I don't know. We seem to think of it as a monolith, but it's not. So the Arya Samaj and the Hindu Mahasabha of the 1920s is very different from the Arya Samaj and Hindu Mahasabha of the 1940s, which are the partition years. And they have different faces for different parts of the country. The Arya Samaj played a very dubious and violent role in the police action here. The Arya Samaj played a much more benign role in southern India, for example, in at least Tamil Nadu, well, Andhra Pradesh, Telangana are southern India, but say in Tamil Nadu, for example, where they remained mildly Hindu reformist organizations. They didn't achieve more traction than that. And they had no place almost in certain other parts of the country. Hindu Mahasabha likely. And the Hindu Mahasabha always had a cohort of interesting liberal thinkers, which is also very, like Jayankar, for example, the barrister, who was very close to Ambedkar. So these organizations have never been of one kind, and they've always reinvented themselves in different parts in different ways. And the kind of virulence you see in Savarkar, you don't see today in, say, someone like Tarun Vijay, for example, if you want a more recent vintage. But you also see a continuity. Certain things cannot be compromised upon, and they will keep reinterpreting them in different ways. But how have they included words like inclusivity? How have they dealt with things like untouchability, gender justice, social justice, and so on? See, here I think a very important thing for us to remember is that for each of our regions, and when I say regions, I don't mean states, I mean historical regions, how have they fielded transformations in the political economy of caste and in the conditions of rule over the years, over the centuries. Let's take the state of Tamil Nadu again. I only know about my own state. We can cry hoarse saying that Dravidian model, Periyar, we are diverse, we very conveniently start with very early literature when we didn't have the makings of a caste society. Then we jump to the colonial period, leaving 1500 years when much of the literature was spiritual, religious, and all those wonderful temples that were built by all those wonderful dynasties. All of this stuff where the Hindu social order, its political economy, and its state making happened in Tamil, in the Tamil context. At the same time, this was accommodated within and surviving an older culture of how you think about communities, think about language, think about various things. So the Hindu social order has always been very supple. It has been able to work with change, but I don't mean this again in a negative sense. It also has to change. It also has to open up, and some opportunities are opened, some things get remade, which is what you see in Karnataka also during the long stretch of the Bhakti movement. If you read medieval Kannadiga, the sad thing is we don't read medieval history. No, we either remain with ancient India, ancient Tamil Nadu, then jump to colonial India. But the medieval period is the most interesting in many ways because there were changes, there were challenges, some things were absorbed, some things couldn't be absorbed. There was a shifting of things. The presence of Islam did very many fascinating things in the Deccan. So we don't quite know the rational values, which also, even if you read something like Krishna and his Geeta, you see Ambedkar saying that. When he says that the Krishna, that Bhagavad Gita, like some other scholars said at that time, Dharmananda Kosambi, for example, is a response to Buddhism. That's Ambedkar's argument, basically. And now Ambedkar is wanting to tell you how seriously Brahmanical Hinduism took Buddhism, that it had to philosophically over a period of time absorb its tenets. Whether that's historically a viable argument, historians can decide. But there has been a tendency also within what we today call Hinduism, different aspects of it, which has had that tendency. But today you have a brutal accommodation of things, which is really sort of, again, this is why the fascist and the Brahmanical aspect has to be related better. Fascism concentrates on negative energy, on building on resentment and hatred. Brahmanism, in a philosophical sense, can be guileful, clear, brilliant, strategic, or all of these things. But Brahmanism at present is absorbed by this fascism also. So, it's a very interesting thing to think about. But again, I feel the lessons to be learned are from the medieval period. Going back to Aryan times and sort of saying some stuff that happened 5,000, stuff that happened in the 15th century, 16th century, 17th century. I think those are very important years for us.
Really nice.
Oh, lovely.
Huh?
Oh gosh, this is so sweet.
Yeah.
Oh. So I will always remember love.
Thank everybody for joining this evening. We look forward to your company. Have a good night.
Thanks everyone for those questions.